That's right. You read the title correctly. My dog nearly died because of my own sister. And no, this isn't some exaggerated clickbait. This is one of the most heartbreaking stories we've ever covered, not just because a dog was hurt, but because the person who did it shares the same blood. What makes this story different? It's not about betrayal from a stranger. It's about realizing that the person you once called family might be the one you should fear the most. Stay tuned, because what happens next will make you question loyalty, love, and who truly deserves to be called family. Emily, a 29-year-old woman, lived alone in a small apartment in the middle of a bustling city. But she never felt lonely because by her side was always Benny, the loyal golden retriever, who had been with her for the past 5 years. Benny wasn't just a pet. To Emily, he was family. The friend who would never betray her. The gentle light in the darkest days of her life. Emily's older sister, Sarah, was 4 years her senior. After years of struggling with infertility, Sarah finally gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The entire family was overwhelmed with joy, calling the child God's miracle. All the attention, love, and expectations shifted towards Sarah and Emily. With all her heart, was genuinely happy for her sister. Back then, Sarah adored Benny. She once even joked, "If Benny were a real person, I'd make him my godson." Everything used to feel so warm, so close. But ever since the baby was born, Emily began to notice. Something had changed. Something subtle, quiet, but undeniably uncomfortable. That weekend afternoon, Emily brought Benny over to her sister's house like she always did. She knew Sarah was busy with the newborn, so she only planned to stay a short while. As usual, Benny lay calmly on the rug near the door, resting his head gently on Emily's foot. No barking, no mischief, just quietly observing. He always knew how to behave, especially when there was a baby in the house. But then the baby suddenly started crying. Sarah, holding her child in her arms, sharply turned toward Benny, her eyes cold, her voice slicing through the air. "Can you take that stinky dog outside? He's making my baby uncomfortable." Emily froze, not because of the request, but because of the tone. The words were sharp as knives, no hesitation, no warmth. Sarah, the same person who once lovingly called Benny her godson, now looked at him like trash in the way. It was winter outside. The wind was biting, cutting through skin. Snow covered the entire backyard. Emily bent down to stroke Benny gently and whispered, "It's really cold out, Sarah." But without another word, she quietly led Benny out of the house. No arguing, no anger, but in her heart, a quiet, aching wound formed. That was the first moment Emily realized Benny was no longer seen as part of the family. And maybe, just maybe, she herself was slowly being pushed out of that so-called inner circle of kin. Emily still remembers that night clearly, just about a week after she quietly led Benny out of her sister's house. That day, Sarah called and invited her over for dinner with the family. Emily hesitated. The uncomfortable feeling from last time hadn't faded. But eventually she agreed, partly because she didn't want things to feel tense, and partly because she thought maybe she was just tired that day. Having a newborn is tough. This time Emily left Benny at home. She didn't say why, but deep down she knew bringing him along would only make dinner heavy and awkward. As Benny trailed behind her, eyes filled with quiet sadness, while she put on her coat, Emily knelt down and stroked his head. "Just for a little while. I'll be back soon." Dinner started off normal until Sarah, in the middle of picking vegetables for her child, casually dropped a line. "Cold. Loaded with judgment, I told you. I don't want a dog around my baby. After all, it's just an animal, not a person. There's no need for you to be so attached." It hit like a bucket of ice in the middle of the meal. Not just a reminder, It was a direct stab at what Emily held most dear. Sarah didn't raise her voice, but every word, every syllable dripped with contempt. Her face was blank. No sympathy, no hesitation. As if Benny was trash that needed to be removed from their lives. Emily froze. She didn't respond. She didn't argue. She just smiled faintly, as if to move past the topic. But inside, her heart felt like it was being crushed. To Sarah, Benny was just an animal. To Emily, he was her safe place. The one friend who never left, no matter how cold the world outside became. That night, Emily went home early. After that dinner, she never brought Benny to her sister's house again. Because it was clear not just Benny, but Emily herself, was no longer welcome. And this was only the beginning of a much darker nightmare. Early Friday morning, Sarah texted Emily saying her house was being fumigated and she needed a place to stay for 2 days. She asked if she could bring the baby along just to keep things smooth. Emily hesitated. After everything that had happened, there was a cold, vague distance between them. But like always, she gave in. She's still my sister. I can't stay bitter forever over the past. Emily tidied up the living room, set out pillows and blankets, and clearly labeled where Benny's food and water were kept. Before leaving on her business trip, she gently reminded Sarah, "Just feed him on time and open the backyard door. Benny's very well behaved. He never bothers anyone." She left with a small sense of peace, believing that even if Sarah no longer cared for Benny, the way she used to at the very least, she was a mother, an adult who couldn't possibly be that irresponsible. Sunday night, Emily returned. But from the very first moment she stepped inside, something was wrong. No rushing paws, no familiar wagging tail. Benny the dog, who always greeted her with overwhelming joy, was nowhere to be found. She called out, voice trembling. "Benny, where are you?" No reply. The house was dead silent. Emily searched every room, every corner, until she stopped at the laundry room door. It was tightly shut. Her hand rested on the doorknob, her heart pounding. When the door swung open, Emily nearly collapsed. The stench of urine, mildew, dried feces, and something else. Like blood. In the corner of the cold, tiled floor was Benny, lying motionless, filthy, shaking, barely able to stand. One eye swollen and purple, and on his left leg, dried blood oozed from a patch of fur that had been scraped clean off. Benny didn't bark, didn't whimper. He just looked at Emily with eyes red, terrified, and so full of despair it shattered her. Emily rushed to him, cradled him close, whispering his name, hands trembling as she stroked his back. She touched his side, and Benny flinched, violently, letting out a soft cry. That's when she saw it. His body was covered in bruises. He had been beaten. Emily carried Benny out of that prison, wrapped him in warm towels, and gave him water sip by sip, like she was nursing him back to life. Tears welled up. She was on the verge of sobbing. And just then, Sarah walked down the stairs, holding her baby, casually yawning as she asked, "He's still lying there." "What's the big deal?" Emily turned, eyes, bloodshot voice breaking. "You locked him in there for 2 days. No food, no water. And you hit him." Sarah shrugged. "He kept staring at my baby and made him cry. I got annoyed. Anyway, it's just a dog. Don't be so dramatic." Emily stood frozen. No apology, not a trace of remorse. Benny, that loyal, gentle, innocent creature, had become a punching bag for a stressed, cruel mother. If Emily had come back even 1 day later, she might have been carrying out Benny's lifeless body. Starved, dehydrated, beaten to death, in the dark laundry room of the very house she once called home. And in that very moment, Emily understood. Blood means nothing without humanity. And some things, once trampled, cannot be undone. not even with an apology, no matter how sincere. Benny was now nothing more than a small, fragile ball of fur curled up on the rug, his head resting on Emily's foot. His eyes were shut tight, and every so often his entire body twitched from exhaustion and dehydration. Emily couldn't shake from her mind the image of Benny locked in that cold laundry room, a dark, suffocating, silent place, like a prison where no light could reach, where a gentle creature had been abandoned, as if he wasn't even worth existing. Sarah, her sister, still casually held her baby in her arms, as if she had just finished folding laundry, not nearly killed a living being through starvation, confinement, and possibly abuse. Her face was completely blank, eyes hollow, not a flicker of guilt, as if she didn't even realize she had crossed every line of human decency. Emily took a deep breath. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't break down. She looked Sarah straight in the eyes and said, her voice low, colder than the winter wind, "From now on, you're not allowed in my home. And you should know. You're lucky I haven't called the police. It wasn't a threat, it was a final sentence." Sarah froze for a few seconds, then simply shrugged. She turned and walked upstairs without looking back. No apology, no concern for Benny's condition, not an ounce of remorse. The house then sank into a heavy, suffocating silence, not because no one was speaking, but because there was simply nothing left to say. Emily cleaned Benny with the same towel she always brought on long trips. She wrapped him in the warmest sweater she owned, then sat quietly on the sofa. Benny stayed pressed close to her side, refusing to move even half a step, as if terrified that, if he closed his eyes, the next time he opened them, she might be gone. Emily held Benny the way someone holds a child who's just survived a disaster. Tears rolled down her cheeks, not from weakness, but from a pain too deep to contain. That night, she didn't sleep. She just sat there, gently stroking Benny's back part to comfort him, part to keep herself from falling apart. And in her mind, question after question echoed. How could someone from your own family be so cruel? Why do people use family as an excuse to justify their cruelty? And why had she ever believed her sister was someone she could trust for life? By the time the first light of dawn crept in, Benny had finally fallen asleep in Emily's arms. And Emily, she had run out of tears. But deep in her heart, one truth had never been clearer. From that moment on, the line had been drawn sharply, permanently. Sarah was no longer someone Emily could call family, and the door to this house, just like the door to Emily's heart, would never open to her again. Nearly a month had passed since that fateful night. Benny had recovered both physically and emotionally. Emily remained silent. No texts, no calls, no visits to her parents. She needed space to breathe and to avoid hearing the name Sarah. But then on a Monday morning, her phone buzzed. A message from Sarah. "Hey, I'm going back to work this week. Can you help watch the baby 2 days a week? I'm really in a bind." Emily stared at the screen, her hand clenched tightly. In her mind, images flashed like a rewinding film: the laundry room, Benny's wounds, his trembling eyes. No apology. No phone call to explain. And now she had the nerve to come back. Asking for help, Emily didn't respond. She turned her phone face down, walked out to the balcony, and held Benny in her arms. The sky that day was strangely blue. But inside her, everything felt heavy, clouded, and choked. That evening, she finally replied with a short message. "Sorry, I can't." Not even an hour passed before Sarah's messages came flooding in like a storm. "Why would you say no? I thought you cared about your nephew. You care more about a dog than your own sister. You're so petty. What kind of family keeps score like this?" Emily read every word, feeling like her chest was being crushed. Not because of the insults, but because of the audacity. This was the same person who had nearly killed the creature she loved most. Now throwing around sisterhood to manipulate her guilt. She couldn't hold it in any longer. She typed each word carefully. You use family to make demands, but treated Benny and me like enemies. Don't use that word to justify cruelty. Sarah replied immediately. I'm tired of your victim act. That dog was locked up for 2 days, he didn't even die. Stop acting like it was a funeral. Emily let the phone fall from her hands. Her fingers trembled with rage. The next morning, her mother called. Her voice was low, weary. Emily, I don't understand you. Benny is just a dog, but Sarah is your sister. She's blood. Emily went quiet, then gently asked, and if I had come home too late that day, and Benny had died, what would you have said then? It's just a dead dog. There was silence on the other end for several seconds. Then her mother sighed. Don't hold grudges. I know your sister was wrong. But family is about forgiveness, about helping each other. Emily looked down at Benny, now dozing peacefully in her arms, and gripped the phone tighter. Why is it that when someone hurts you, you're expected to stay silent just because they're family? Why does blood become a shield against accountability? She took a deep breath and replied, calm but firm. I forgave her by not calling the police. But I can't forget, and I can't help someone who tortured what I love as if nothing ever happened. The call ended with a long, heart-wrenching sigh. It's up to you. But I'm very disappointed. Emily hung up. Benny lifted his head, wagging his tail gently, as if to comfort her. She looked down, gave him a sad smile, and whispered, Only you have never made me feel guilty for loving you. Emily used to think of herself as someone soft-hearted, quick to forgive, quick to let things go. She always believed that if one day a serious conflict arose within the family, she'd be the first to make peace. The one who would take the first step, swallow the pain, and smooth things over. Because she understood. No one's perfect. Everyone loses their temper. Everyone has careless moments. But what happened with Benny changed everything. She didn't refuse to babysit because she hated the child. And it certainly wasn't about revenge against Sarah. It was because she couldn't pretend nothing had happened. Not when the creature she loved most had nearly died, and the one responsible had never even acknowledged they were wrong. Emily had made it back just in time. Only a few hours earlier than when tragedy might have struck. If her flight had been delayed, if a storm had kept her grounded, if she had come back Monday morning instead of Sunday night, then what she would have found in that laundry room wouldn't have been a trembling dog, but a cold, lifeless body. Dead in the dark, starving, thirsty, and alone in despair. But what Emily found unforgivable wasn't just the cruelty itself, it was the silence that followed. No apology, no trace of remorse, not even a simple question. Is Benny okay? No message, not even a performative one. Emily had waited. She had hoped foolishly that Sarah would have a moment of clarity, that she'd realize she had gone too far. But instead, Emily received were bitter accusations that she was petty selfish, all because she wouldn't help watch a child. Emily wondered, what if the roles were reversed? If she had locked Sarah's child in a sealed room for 2 days, no food, no water, no light? Would Sarah look her in the eyes and casually say, I didn't mean to. Why are you making this such a big deal? Of course not. So why, when it came to Benny, a being who could feel, who could love, who could suffer? Was it so easy to dismiss as just a dog? Emily never saw Benny as just a dog. To her, he was a companion, a family member, the only one who never betrayed her, no matter how many times life had brought her to her knees. And for someone like that, someone who had once been cruel and then showed no remorse, Emily knew she couldn't let them back into her life. Not even once more. Because this wasn't about a dog or a child anymore. This was about respect, about character, and about boundaries. Emily had chosen to stand with the only one who had never caused her pain. The small dog now sleeping peacefully beside her, still trusting her completely, even after being abandoned in the dark by her own flesh and blood. After everything, Emily sat quietly for a long time, asking herself, should I call the police by law? Confining, starving, and beating an animal for 48 hours, especially when there are visible signs of injury, is grounds for legal action. It can result in fines, even criminal prosecution for animal abuse. She had all the evidence, photos, timestamps, Benny's physical condition, and Sarah's own cold, unapologetic admission. But she didn't do it. Not because she feared drama. Not because she wanted to protect the family's reputation. Emily didn't call the police. She didn't post about it on social media. She didn't send angry texts, seek revenge, or air it out to claim some kind of moral victory. She just disappeared. A quiet exit, firm but without noise. No tears, no theatrics, no public blame. She cut off all contact with Sarah. No messages, no answering calls. She didn't show up for family dinners if she knew Sarah would be there. Emily didn't need to hear any more excuses, because she knew some cracks can't be fixed with words. She didn't want revenge, because Emily had come to understand. Peace doesn't come from hurting someone back. It comes from making sure they can never hurt you again. For years, Emily had always been the soft one, the one who stayed quiet, the one who fought to keep relationships alive when she was the only one still trying. But after what happened with Benny, she finally understood. Holding on to kindness doesn't mean holding on to people who don't deserve it. She chose to let go, not out of hatred, not out of bitterness, simply because she no longer needed to be there. And from that day on, Emily felt lighter. She spent more time with Benny, with herself, and with people who truly valued her presence. She no longer felt guilty for setting boundaries. In fact, she felt free. Because sometimes peace of mind matters more than blood. Because not everyone who shares your blood deserves to walk with you to the end of your journey. Benny couldn't speak. He couldn't tell Emily about the terror he felt locked in that cold, dark room. He couldn't describe the loneliness, the dry ache in his throat, or the panic of waiting through 2 endless days without anyone coming to open the door. But Emily didn't need him to speak. She just had to look into his eyes, those tired, trembling eyes that still tried to crawl toward her, as if to say, I'm still here. I waited for you. And in that moment, Emily understood something more clearly than any words could ever explain. Dogs can't speak, but they always know who truly loves them. There are people who use stress, busyness, or being too exhausted from motherhood as excuses for their neglect. But Emily knew the truth. Real love doesn't need excuses. Real love isn't cruel, even when no one's watching. This story isn't just about a dog who nearly died. It's not just about a cold-hearted sister or a woman who chose to stand up for what she loved most. It's about boundaries, about knowing who to hold on to and who to let go. Not everyone who shares your blood deserves your forgiveness. Some relationships, even those labeled family, if they hurt you too deeply too often. Walking away isn't a betrayal. It's protection. It's a form of love, but this time for yourself. And if you're ever torn between loving others and honoring yourself, remember this. You don't have to choose. You deserve both.